Greetings and salutations, everyone, for the second installment here on the Sean McDowell and Dr. Titus Kennedy interview on the early date of the Exodus. Excuse me, where Dr. Titus Kennedy here on the right hand side of the screen will seek to defend the early Exodus date. If you guys haven't watched the previous video, part 1, I encourage you to do so, where they discuss topics like the Brooklyn Papyrus and the names on the Brooklyn Papyrus. We also went into what the Sinai looked like in the savannah, and stuff. So today or tonight, depending on where you are in the world, we will be finishing this video between these two men and see where it goes from there. So without further ado, I would like to get started if I can. Oop, sorry about that. I'm making sure everything's ready. Okay, we are ready to go.
As slaves.
Before he begins, I should like to remind everyone that I did rewind it a little bit. So, before they start talking about the Ipuwer papyrus, which is where we left off, was the Ipuwer papyrus. So, I just wanted to let you guys know about that. So here we go.
Making bricks, etc. But then you talk about what you call the possibility of an Egyptian remembrance or record of the plagues, what's called the admonitions of an Egyptian sage, but more commonly, as far as I understand it, the Ipuwer papyrus. What is this, and how might it help us in understanding the case for the Exodus?
I'm just going to let him speak before I interject, by the way. When he finishes, I'll add some comments, my comments.
So this is an Egyptian papyrus that dates to the 13th century BC, at least the copy that we have. There's only one copy known in existence today. It was composed sometime before that, so before the 13th century BC. And the author, his name was Ipuwer, so that's why it's often called the Ipuwer papyrus. Now, most scholars put the composition pretty early, like at least the second intermediate period. Some would even put it in the Middle Kingdom in the past, some even pushed it farther back. But if we look at...
No disagreement there. There is debate about when the Ipuwer papyrus, the admonitions of Ipuwer, actually was written. Some do date it to the Middle Kingdom, some do date it to the second intermediate period, so.
Details of the linguistics, some of the words and phrases that are used there, they only come into use in the 18th dynasty. And so it looks more like it was composed in the 18th dynasty, or at least rewritten with the language of that time. Now, the content is something that got people interested in this text in terms of connecting it to the Exodus, because in general, it's a poem that is talking about destruction and death throughout the land of Egypt. But there are some really interesting lines in there, like the river has turned to blood. So the Nile River has turned to blood. Blood is all throughout the land of Egypt. And that, people reading that, they just immediately think, oh,
yeah,
that sounds like the Exodus story. And so that's where the connection initially came in. But if you read through the text, there are a variety of different components that have parallels in the Exodus story. And this is not just some crazy ideas, right? The foremost scholar in the world on this papyrus actually says in his book on it that he notes there are linguistic and thematic parallels between what...
Okay, sorry, I thought I paused it. I lied. I thought I was gonna let him. I would like to know what scholar he's talking about who did his work on the admonitions of Ipuwer. He doesn't actually say, is part of the problem. So it would be great if he actually came up with a name who actually did work on the Ipuwer, on the admonitions of Ipuwer. That would be fantastic, but unfortunately, he doesn't reveal who that is, the Egyptologist. So, um, sorry, folks.
Ipuwer's writing and the Exodus story or the Exodus plagues. But he says because neither text is writing about an historical event, they can't be talking about the same thing.
Gotcha.
So that's the general view. But there are things in there like the sun or the power of the sun god Ra not being seen. This darkness, the blood, as I
Wow.
mentioned, plague and pestilence throughout the land, grain being destroyed, some kind of disease causing physical disfigurement and pain. All these different people are dying, mourning, rebellion against the sun god, the absence of the Egyptian gods, the Pharaoh not doing his job, and then uh, gold, silver, and jewelry being in the possession of the slaves. So these are all things that we see in the Exodus story. And those parallels, I think, are very powerful. Uh, Obviously, we do have linguistic and thematic parallels, but if the chronology could line up and they're talking about historical events, then I think what we have here is a poetic
Hmm.
version from an Egyptian, not the royal annals, talking about that time of the Exodus.
So this is admittedly built on some.
All right, a few things on the Ipuwer Papyrus. Everything he said was absolutely true. That's exactly what the admonitions of Ipuwer contain. And it usually dates to the Middle Kingdom. Some people date it to the second intermediate period, which is true. There's some debate about when that happens. But what's interesting is that those Egyptologists, um, like Fall Kitchen, I want to say, does Dr. Teeter? Does Emily Teeter? I want to say Teeter does too. I'm not sure. I can't be sure on that one, so don't quote me. But most of them, I think, tend to date the admonitions of Ipuwer in the Middle Kingdom towards the end of the Middle Kingdom, which makes perfect sense considering the Middle Kingdom was falling apart toward at the end of the 13th dynasty, if I'm not mistaken, 12th or 13th dynasty. So, yeah, it makes perfect sense that the admonitions of Ipuwer would be using what I like to call decreation language, which you see throughout the Old Testament, and then it's echoed in Revelation. Um, so, um, where decreation language is this idea or this literary device, if you will, that's used throughout the Old Testament, um, detailing how what that empires will fall, that something bad will happen. You see that in Jeremiah. You see language like that in Jeremiah 4, in which the writer of Jeremiah, or Baruch, details the destruction and fall of Israel, the northern kingdom. So Samaria in particular. So um, you see things like that. And that's no different for the Ipuwer papyrus as well. Decreation language, things are not set aright. Like Kennedy said, the poor have jewelry and silver and gold, which is basically the world turned on its head in Egyptian society. You have the river turning to blood. You have um, pestilence. These things are really common when using decreation language. Um, so to argue that the admonitions of Ipuwer is some sort of poem that describes that could possibly describe something like the Exodus account cannot really be supported or made because he's just using some sort of decreation language. So, if you guys like to see the Ipuwer Papyrus, I can. Let me see, where did I put it? It is right here. This is a copy of some of the Ipuwer Papyrus. It's written in hieratic, which I think my picture does better justice than the one the esteemed Dr. Sean McDowell uses, but I'm not going to digress in that one. So, but this is what it looks like, at least a page of it, if you will. So, Yeah, so we'll continue here with the discussion.
Debate about the dating of it and the interpretation. So it's a possibility, but maybe just a strong possibility, you would say, for an Egyptian record in a more poetic way that seems to match up. So we wouldn't expect this, but I guess you would say this is another interesting piece of the puzzle that adds to the cumulative case that makes it more likely. Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's plausible, and I think it's an interesting text that we need to look at and consider. It is. It's again. It's not an official royal document. It's the
Okay.
work of a poet or a bard, so it's going to be a little bit different than when we're reading the Pharaoh's annals. But we
Sorry, I'm giggling. Anals. Sorry, annals, but that's fine.
also couldn't say that this is definitive evidence. Again, like you said, there are debates. There's different interpretations about the time of composition and if it's talking about historical events.
So if your chronology is correct, which pharaoh would have ruled during this time? And is there any evidence that ties this pharaoh to the Exodus?
I would take the position that the Pharaoh at the time of the Exodus was Amenhotep II. And
And that's a pretty common assessment for early date proponents. They usually choose Amenhotep II because he ruled for a long time, and he was a strong pharaoh. He was well educated, and all that sort of thing. So we'll get into later, but his firstborn son was mysteriously vanished. He'll discuss this in a little bit, so we'll let him get there first.
I do believe that we have several, at least pieces of circumstantial evidence that connect this pharaoh to the Exodus. There's no smoking gun, so to speak, with an
Sure.
inscription of him talking about Hebrew slaves exiting, but there are several components of the Exodus story that we see illustrated during his reign that, as one thing we could say that's just a coincidence, but as
Okay.
several, it really got to get us thinking, this seems to line up, this could be the guy.
Well, let's talk about a few of those. I know you've hinted at one is the character, what we know from the Exodus story and externally from other writings about this pharaoh. How does the character help with this?
I think the character helps with it because we see in the Exodus story that the Pharaoh is depicted as extremely arrogant and stubborn.
Hmm.
And Amenhotep is exactly that kind of Pharaoh. He even wrote in his own text that he was the greatest king that had ever existed.
Wow.
And then he talks about crazy feats like he could shoot arrows through the thick bronze target, which is physically just not possible, or he could row a boat by himself faster than a whole crew of sailors. He
Hmm.
was at the head of his army, supposedly killing all of his enemies and the foreign princes by himself. So he really seemed to be compensating for something
Hmm.
and incredibly confident in himself. And as a result, most Egyptologists, they see the things that he talks about and he writes about himself, and they just say, this guy liked to brag, and this stuff is propaganda.
Hmm.
But it really does at least fit the psychological profile.
So the psychology matches up. What?
So, a couple of things here about Amenophis. I'm using the Greek term. Forgive me, Egyptologists. Amenem Amenhotep II. Let me tell you a couple of things about this. Titus Kennedy is right. There's some. He does boast himself. But the problem is every Egyptian pharaoh did. It's about they always boasted themselves before the gods. Again, I said this in the previous video. These are religious texts that we find on temple walls, that we find in their tombs, and everything. So there's always going to be that self-aggrandizement um, in the pharaoh's tombs. I think I said this in the previous video, and I'm sure Dr. Falk mentioned it in Ancient Egypt in the Bible as well. You record your successes. The pharaohs and the pharaohs and the scribes and anyone who could forward a tomb always recorded their successes rather than their failures before the gods. So with the Amenhotep II here, it's nothing different. It's nothing. There's nothing new under the sun with that. So, I think he's looking for a character, a pharaoh that maybe fits that description, and he seems to be shoehorning that into a Amenhotep II. So, I'm gonna get punished for saying that, but um, that's just my opinion on the issue. But we'll let him continue here. I think there's just better evidence for the late date as far as choosing a pharaoh for this. But there's nothing really new under the sun choosing a pharaoh as far as self-aggrandizement is concerned. So,
What about archaeologically? You've talked about what's called the Memphis Stele of Amenhotep.
oh, okay. Dang it, I failed. I meant to look this up. I'm sorry, guys. Let me see if I can find it here. Oop. Find it for you guys here. I always like to provide some sort of like imagery. So, you hear people talk about this stele, this a seal or whatever. I usually like to come across. I usually like to find the Memphis Stele, which where is it? Oh dear, I may not be able to find it here. Um, let's narrow it down here. Is this it? Um, oh well. We'll let them go on, but yeah, my apologies, folks. I don't want to bring up the wrong Stele and then so we'll just let them go on. My apologies. I usually like to provide some sort of visual for people who aren't Egyptologists. When someone talks about a particular stele, temple, relief, whether that's a bas relief or not, I usually like to provide that visual. It helps me anyway.
So Amenhotep II, he had what seems like two military campaigns. One was at the beginning of his reign, and one was a few years in, about year nine. So in year nine of his reign, he talks about how he went into Canaan and he essentially did a slave raid. He took back all of these people as prisoners to be used as slaves. In fact, if you total them up, it's about 101,000 slaves that he supposedly takes back. And he
Wow.
says he took back over 1,000 chariots and over 13,000 weapons of war. So if we're looking at the Exodus happened just before this, and they lost a big component of their slave population, and they lost all their chariots, and they lost a bunch of soldiers. They need to resupply. And Egyptologists look at this text and they say, again, this is exaggeration. It's some propaganda. He didn't take that many people or all that stuff, probably. But, whether he did or not, what the text demonstrates, I think, is that he wants to show people that he has done
Hmm.
this. So if those events happen, it would really make sense that he.
I will also like to add that it's actually, I think, rather common for 18th dynasty pharaohs to go on raiding parties, particularly in Nubia. Um, and since Tutmosis the Third or Tutmosis the Third go on raiding parties in the Levant. Um, so this is not uncommon for Amenhotep II. So
He wants to put this out there for everybody in Egypt to see, guys, I fixed the problem. I got some new slaves for us. I got chariots. I got weapons. We're going to be okay.
What about Moses serving in the court when he's younger? And then, what is it, 40 years later comes back and there's a new Pharaoh? Does that chronology match up?
I think that is.
it actually does. At least for the late date, it does. And considering the pharaohs who came before Seti the First and Ramses the First, Ramses the First was the founder of the 19th dynasty. If you look at the pharaohs right before, between Tutankhamun and Ramses the First, you have I, and then you have Horemheb, and those are some nasty individuals. So, and then Ramses the Second only reigned, or not second, Ramses the First reigned for only 2 years, I think, and Seti the First reigned a little longer, and then you get Ramses the Second. So, as far as the account in Exodus that mentions the Pharaoh throwing the male children into the Nile River, Horemheb and I fit that description, either one of them, because they're nasty pharaohs. I couldn't tell you which one, so, but yeah.
An vastly underappreciated and overlooked component.
And before he goes on, I should like to mention that you get Amenhotep the First before Amenhotep the Second, obviously, because one comes before two. But you get pharaohs that preceded Amenhotep the Second, and they're not that evil. They're not even. They couldn't come up with the stuff that I and Horemheb could even do. So something like that. So.
The story. So we have, as you said, Moses. He kills the Egyptian. He flees into the wilderness. He's there for 40 years. Then God tells him, "Hey, the Pharaoh who is pursuing you has died. You can go back to Egypt now." Well, that seems to indicate that the Pharaoh who was in power when Moses left continued to rule for those 40.
Also, I should like to mention here about the 40 years again. Can also mean just a long period of time. Just a long period of time. We talked about that last week during the first part about 1 Kings 6:1, and the years that oh wow, I'm brain farting now. The when the temple was constructed in 966. So, and then you had the 480 years that supposedly or allegedly separated the time that the temple was built to the time the Exodus happened, which would put it in 1446. That 40 years could also mean that it was just a long period of time.
40 years. And so we're essentially looking for the pre-Exodus Pharaoh who has a reign of 40 or more years. Now, there are hardly any pharaohs in Egyptian history who rule more than 40 years. One of the few happens to be the father of Amenhotep II, who.
This is a case of taking the years in a wooden, literal meaning. I think, again, my friend Dr. Falk has mentioned this before with ABR, Associates for Biblical Research, is that you have to take the years literally according to them. And that's just simply not so, because we could just say, we use hyperbole in English all the time, and I'm not the first one to say something like this. We say, I've been waiting here for 1,000,000 years, you'll hear a kid say, or it feels like forever since you went into the doctor's office and now you've come out. Things like that. So, or I feel like I've been waiting here 10 years, blah, blah, blah. As grown-ups or adults, we say things like that. So to take numbers like that literally can become problematic. So this seems to be the case of some sort of problematic thing. So
was in power 54 years. So I think that is something that lines up really nicely. And again, it's circumstantial, but we don't have many options at all in terms of where that could be placed in Egyptian history.
That's amazing. Like, I realize people are going to assess this evidence differently based on their expectations, their understanding of scripture and history. But to me, this is more than I would have expected as you piece these parts together that fit the story of, the Exodus. Now, this next one we're going to talk about, when I read it, I was unaware of this and kind of blown away that you talk about evidence for the plague involving the death of the firstborn, and in particular, the death of the son of.
I got a couple of comments on this, but I'll let Dr. Kennedy here speak on this.
Of Pharaoh and what's called, I believe, the Dream Stele. Talk about that.
Oh. Before he starts, let me show you guys what the Dream Stele. I think this is, yes, this is it. This is what the Dream Stele looks like. Ooh, sorry if you were, we're gonna, but this is the Dream Stele, and it's found at between the paws of this. If you go between the paws of the Sphinx, it's right there. This is what the Sphinx is. Or the Sphinx. Yes, that's what the Sphinx is. Sorry, folks. That's what the Dream Stele looks like. Sphinx is much larger. Unfortunately, my Egyptian's kind of rusty, so I can't pinpoint some of these things in the cartouches. I think I see Tutmosis' name right here in this cartouche. If you're watching and your Egyptian's better than mine, your ancient Egyptian, please let me know if I'm wrong. But just want to give you an overview of what the Dream Stele looks like. And the Dream Stele, well, I'll let Dr. Kennedy go on here about this.
Yes, so the Dream Stele was situated between the paws of the Sphinx. So everybody knows about the Sphinx at Giza. And this came about what seems to be,
for the record, my picture's better,
as a result of the next pharaoh, so Thutmose IV. He was the son of Amenhotep II, who became the next pharaoh. He seems to be needing divine endorsement to legitimize his role as the next king. So he writes this text and places it there, and he gives us this whole story where he talks about one day he was out hunting and he took a nap by the Sphinx. And the god of the Sphinx came to him and said, "Hey, if you clear the sand away from me, I'm going to make you the king." So he's giving him a divine endorsement and blessing. He does this little thing for him. And so it makes it sound like all along, Thutmose IV was the son who was supposed to become the king. And the gods, they had set that up and they gave him a special divine revelation that would happen. And so everybody in Egypt should be like, oh, this is great. The gods, they knew what was going on. They planned it. Because the thing is, Thutmose IV was not the firstborn son.
Tutmosis the Fourth, or Tutmosis the Fourth. That's bugging me, but anyway.
An heir of Amenhotep II. He had an older brother. In fact, his older brother seems to appear on that stele, the figure of him, but he's partially scratched out. We don't know a whole lot about him. It seems his name was also Amenhotep. He was a priest, and he just disappears from history. Presumably dies rather than fled Egypt or something like that.
Okay.
This happened, right? This happened sometimes, but it's really interesting, this sequence of events, where it's situated chronologically. We might have the mummy of this prince, maybe. There's a possibility that it's this mummy called Unknown Man C that was found in the cache of these royal 18th dynasty mummies. There's some other ideas about instead of a first son named Amenhotep, that he had a different name. But anyway, we know that Thutmose IV was not the firstborn son, and his older brother, who was the heir, disappeared mysteriously. So he seeks divine endorsement. Again, if these plagues happen and the firstborn of Pharaoh died, then we would expect something like this to happen.
All right, a couple of things here. Yes, Amenhotep II's son mysteriously vanished, and we don't know really what happened, so there's a lot of speculation and conjecture surrounding that, and rightfully so. If you don't really know, people begin to speculate and conjecture. Well, maybe this happened. Well, maybe that happened. We're not really sure, and we usually give it some sort of air of doubt. But what's interesting, as I made that little blunder there, is Ramesses II also lost a firstborn son at a very young age. And I'm probably gonna butcher his name, but his name is, I think, what is it? It's Amun. It's Amun Ko Hepesh, I think. And again, don't quote me, but but Ramesses II also lost a son, a firstborn son. I'm not sure if we found his mummy at all, like a cache of 19th dynasty mummies or whatever. But it's interesting to know that Ramesses II also lost a firstborn son as well. I'm sorry for the Egyptologists who may be listening and I completely butchered his name. So it's just interesting that the late date pharaoh also lost a son as well, a firstborn son no less.
That is so interesting. There's far more pieces of this story that we have possible connections to that are what we would expect if it were true. But is it fair to say, we're going to get into more of the evidence, that because people begin with the assumption, many scholars, that this is mythological, that they're not looking at this evidence, not piecing this together, interpreting it in a different fashion? Is that fair?
Yeah, when you come with the presupposition that the story is mythical and there's not going to be any evidence for it, or you might even be looking in a different time period, then of course they're going to look at things differently, and they're going to I think individualize the components of the evidence rather than look at it as a cumulative story or a cumulative case. And they will say like, okay, that's interesting about the Dream Stele, but just because his older brother died and then he got a divine endorsement doesn't mean he died in
Sure.
the plague. Well, of course not. But we're not looking at all these things in isolation. We're looking at all of this different circumstantial and some not so circumstantial all together flowing with this story, this narrative that's laid out in Exodus. And the probability for all of those things happening together, all of this
Mm.
circumstantial evidence and some of more ambiguous but less circumstantial happening in the right sequence, the right time, all the right way, that probability is so low that I think we're able to say we have strong evidence for the plausibility of this story being corroborated archaeologically.
Mm. Titus, it seems like those who take a different position than you.
Well, before he goes on here, I should like to mention that there is evidence for an Exodus account, for an Exodus event that is laid out in the book of Exodus, or the book of names, as it's called in Hebrew. Um, there is, but I just think it aligns more with the late date rather than the early date. Um, you don't really have. Now, he doesn't go into this in the interview, I think, if I remember correctly. He doesn't go into this in the interview. But the Exodus account talks about the loss of the cherry tree, not entirely, but the loss of some cherry tree. And then the plagues and everything, and you would expect to find something on that grand of a scale as far as the plagues are concerned. That should have brought the Egyptian economy to a halt, a standstill, especially with the loss of the chariot tree. You would expect some sort of military weakness, and you just don't see that with Amenhotep II, to be honest. You don't see the Egyptian economy sort of halt in the middle of the 18th dynasty. You don't see the Egyptian army some sort of come up uh, that there's some sort of weakness in the Egyptian army right after the chariot tree drowns in the Reed Sea. Yes, it's the Reed Sea, not the Red Sea. We'll discuss that. I'll discuss that in a short when I talk about text criticism. But you just don't see that in the 18th dynasty. So, whereas you do in the 19th dynasty and into the 20th with the slow decline of the New Kingdom prior to that. So, and then you see this like weakness right after the chariotry right after Ramesses II's reign, where they have to fight the Libyans, and then they have to fight the Sea Peoples, and then they lose their foothold in the Levant, which points towards the Canaanite conquest. But we won't get into that for here because that's not what's going on here. But you see that sort of weakness in the Egyptian military in the years after Ramesses II, and you just don't see that with Amenhotep II. The loss of a chariotry, the loss, some sort of military decline a little bit. You just don't see that with Amenhotep II, um, after Amenhotep II with Thutmose IV, and then Amenhotep III. You just don't see that, which I think which I think is a weakness in the early date proponents' arguments. So, anyway.
Just lament the lack of what they consider positive evidence. Is there, on the other hand, is there evidence put forward against the biblical position? And I imagine it could be
Normally, it bugs me when people say the biblical position, but I think McDowell here is not arguing about between the early and late date, saying the early date's biblical or the late date. I think he's just saying actual biblical account found in the book, and not the false dichotomy that I've addressed in other videos. So, just want to point that out. I don't think that's what McDowell's talking about here.
that they found that the pharaohs of this time, for example, like his firstborn became the next pharaoh. Like if he found that out and he was called the firstborn, that would seem to contradict it. Obviously, we don't have that. But are you aware of direct contradictory evidence to the chronology and Exodus story as you've laid out?
No, I don't think so in the 18th dynasty. I mean, I really think the main argument against it is either an absence of evidence or it is a presupposition that this story is mythological, or we could say, it's a way of explaining these things away in isolation, right?
Okay.
So, yeah, where is the negative evidence, right? If we had, I think one of the more difficult ones actually might be uh, a little bit more connected to when the Exodus happened, 15th
Okay.
century, 13th century. Those are the two main. And this city named Ramses, right? And we could get into it and explain it, and I could give you an argument why I think it works in the 15th century too. But that actually does.
Um, a couple of things on the city of Pi Ramses. Um, that city didn't exist until the 19th dynasty. Is the problem? Um, to my understanding, it didn't exist until the 19th dynasty, along with Pithom, which is Pi Atum, Per Atum, which is the house of Atum, and then Pi or Per Ramses, which is the house of Ramses. So it is my understanding, and I think I've got support on this, that those two cities did not exist until the 19th dynasty. So I think that provides another chink in the armor, if you will, for the early day proponents. Unfortunately for them. So
Doesn't
continuing.
remove the Exodus from history. It just might be putting it in a different period and reinterpreting some of those numbers we talked about earlier. So,
Okay.
you know, there's really not definitive negative evidence. There's not evidence against it happening.
Okay.
We're just looking at absence.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Now, the last piece in kind of what you call the A to B argument would be: is there any evidence now that the Hebrew people, the Israelites, leave during this time period and are found wandering in the desert for 40 years? Now, you personally went in and examined some of this evidence, which I found totally fascinating. Talk about the evidence that actually this group of people, the Israelites, in that place in that time, wandered in the desert area that we would expect.
Yeah. So some of the projects I've been involved with, like this, looking at the wandering and then also conquest and settlement in Canaan. So for the wandering, this is somewhat of a problem, but again, it's not unexpected because we can't expect to find archaeological evidence of nomads from 3,400 years ago. Like it's very difficult to even find evidence of nomads from 200 years ago in Sinai. Now, what we do have, though, is some Egyptian inscriptions, two in particular, on a temple, the Soleb Temple, which is in northern Sudan. Now it was southern part of Egypt
Okay,
in
hold on. I'm going to show you guys what this temple is. It's in Sudan. That's Merneptah Stele. So here's the Soleb Temple. What part of it? It's not the whole thing. Not the whole thing. Is this it? Yes. So this is what he's going to talk about. I'm not sure if you guys can clearly see this, but you see a captive with his arms bound behind his back. And underneath that is the cartouche. And the cartouche says, Ta Shasu. Yu. Okay? Again, it's my Egyptian on display, so don't, again, bear with me here. What the cartouche roughly translates is the land of the Shazu, and then it has Yahweh. But I think this is pivotal here, is notice the bound captive. Okay? That's going to be important here in a few minutes when Kennedy goes through his explanation here. So,
ancient times. It was built during the reign of Amenhotep III. So he is the grandson of Amenhotep II. And he reigned around 1400 BC, I think, started just before that, and reigned several years into the early 14th century, a couple decades really. So he's right at the time that the Israelites would be finishing their wandering and then going into Canaan with the chronological scheme that we're looking at. On this temple, there's a pillar that names all these different nomad groups.
and that's part of what I just showed is part of that pillar.
The ones that we can identify seem to be associating their group name with a deity. So we have like nomads that are associated with Baal, and we have nomads that are associated with Anat. And then we have one that says the land of the nomads of Yahweh. So this is the earliest mention of the name Yahweh.
Actually, I don't know about the nomads part, but it does list those other two.
That's ever been discovered. Dates to around 1400 BC. It's on an Egyptian temple of Pharaoh. So the Egyptians knew,
near Nubia, by the way, or in Nubia,
the name Yahweh way back at that time. Even the Pharaoh was familiar with it. This inscription is actually...
And actually, the temple lasted until at least Ramesses III. That's how long the temple lasted. You got Amenhotep III in the 18th dynasty, and then Ramesses III in the, 19th dynasty. I think Ramesses III lived. Don't quote me on that again, but that just to give you an idea of how long that was. It's Amenhotep III all the way down to Ramesses III. So
we found also on a wall of that temple. There's it's a slightly different format, but it also mentions these nomads of Yahweh. So what in the world are nomads of Yahweh doing mentioned on an Egyptian temple at the end of the wandering period? Well, they're situated east of Egypt, maybe in Moab or Transjordan, Edom, something like that, right before they get into Canaan probably. And they are wanderers, just as the Israelites were, and they're the people of Yahweh. And the book of Numbers even talks about the Israelites like that, uses that phrase. So to me, this is Egyptian acknowledgement of a group of nomads who worship Yahweh, who are wandering east of Egypt just before they settle in Canaan. And that is our wandering evidence, primarily.
but the problem is it's a bound captive on the inscription, which seems to suggest that the Egyptians conquered them, or at least defeated them in battle, and then took some back into Egypt as slaves. That's what I wanted to point out, was that it's a bound captive on that pillar. So unless he's gonna relate it to something else, which he'll bring up the Merneptah Stele before anyone says anything. He'll bring up the Merneptah Stele in order to support his claim, I guess, a little bit. But honestly, it falls flat on its face because the Merneptah Stele dates to what, 1209 BC, and it just mentions Israel. It's all it does is mention Israel. Seed is laid waste, and then they double it, the couplet. Seed is laid waste, blah blah blah. So that's what he's gonna use, I think, to prop up. That's what he's gonna use here to prop up his defense of an early date, because it's the other mention of the name of Israel. So
But I think it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, that's amazing. Like you said, what would we expect to find? Yet we have an Egyptian record that dates to the time, mentions the name Yahweh. That's pretty powerful. Now, last piece of this puzzle, we talked about the pre Exodus. There's Semites in the area, which would include Hebrew people, but others. During the time of the Exodus, we find Hebrew slaves given their names, making bricks, doing buildings.
that's the Brooklyn papyrus we mentioned in the previous video.
We find this account that mirrors possibly an Egyptian remembrance of the plagues itself. We have all these facts. Now we have evidence in the wanderings of these kind of Hebrew people, nomads of Yahweh. Is there evidence after this? I know the conquest itself is debatable, and we could do that a whole nother time. But is there evidence then for the Hebrew people showing up about the time after the Exodus and the wandering in Canaan itself?
Yeah, I think we can absolutely say, even going beyond the debate about conquest archaeology, but that there's evidence of settlement of Hebrews, of Israelites in the late Bronze Age, at the end of the late Bronze Age in Canaan. And
Notice he said late Bronze Age.
some of this stuff comes from material culture, like pottery types that are then seen later just in Israelite context. But some other really important, more definitive things archaeologically, I think, like lack of pig bones at sites. So that was an
Oh,
Israelite specific practice. The what's called the Israelite four-room house was a residential architecture that was used throughout the
I should like to mention though, since he's on the topic here, the four-room house, which is indicative to Israel, and the Levant. I should say Levant because um, didn't show up until the EIA or the Early Iron Age, and then onwards you see it in the only in the Levant. At Tel El Daba, you've got evidence of four-room houses. Tel El Daba, which is a city of Avaris, or I don't think it's actually Avaris. I don't think that's the site of Avaris, but there's archaeological evidence of a site called Tel El Daba, and we actually have four-room houses there. But the four-room house didn't show up in the Levant until the early Iron Age, the EIA. So, yeah.
the Israelite period until the Babylonian exile. So that's something else that points to this group of people, Israelites, and there's a huge explosion of new villages that are built and some cities that are re-inhabited. And most archaeologists and historians would say that yeah, this is the time that the Israelites emerged in Canaan. Now, a lot of them today discount the Exodus, even the conquest, but they do say that yeah, here's when the Israelites popped up in
okay.
Canaan. Or some of them might call them proto-Israelites, but they
Mm-hmm.
just want to name something different. So we absolutely do. There's a very famous Egyptian stele called the Merneptah Stele,
Hmm.
sometimes the Israel Stele, and on this Pharaoh Merneptah.
I'll bring that up. Just let you guys know what that looks like, and that is it right here. This is Merneptah Stele. Do not ask me where on earth it says Israel, because I have no idea. I think it's towards the bottom. But Israel is mentioned. The couplet is mentioned down here. So, just to give you an idea of what the Merneptah Stele looks like. So,
Talks about how he went into Canaan, he defeated these three cities, and he says that Israel's seed is no more. And so he mentions
mm,
these people, Israel, in the land of Canaan. They're the only group of people he mentions, and this is the late 13th century BC. So they've already been there. So again, this point A to point B type of argument with the names, with the name of the population group, with some material culture, with some other circumstantial evidence that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Titus, a couple last questions for you and we'll wrap up. Are you aware of further excavations and research that's being done in any way that intersects with the Exodus? Like, what might we expect in the next 3 to 5+ years?
Mm-hmm. So there was a project recently finished in Sinai, and James Hoffmeyer published some articles on this that has to do with the geography of the Exodus that I think is extremely helpful in showing us where some of these things happened and also at least the general time period in Egyptian history. There are also recent excavations at the site of Tel Retaba, which I think is the site of Pithom, which is revealing some really interesting stuff about a Semitic population there prior to the Exodus and then an abandonment during the reign of Amenhotep II. There's continued research on inscriptions that have turned up. Not everything has been translated. Some
Okay.
of the stuff is going to be reevaluated. There's a lot going on, I think, still with kind of the Israelite settlement and conquest period in Canaan that connects to the Exodus. So I think that in the following years, we will see some more evidence that we
Great.
could put in this cumulative case and maybe some things that are more definitive than others.
So I do have to ask you about this. What do you make of the chariot wheels supposedly found at the bottom of the Red Sea? Is that true?
Oh, yes. They went there.
Is that an urban legend that's been passed? Because I've been told that many times as a kid.
Okay, before you go on here. So, the chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea goes back to Ron Wyatt, who is unfortunately now deceased. But he's the one who went over there, the Gulf of Aqaba, and claimed to have discovered chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea. And if you look at the pictures, you can find them easily online. You just do a quick Google search. You will find coral. And apparently, that species of coral that's how it forms. Or it formed on something that supposedly or allegedly looks like a wheel. Which is not at all what an 18th or even 19th dynasty ancient Egyptian chariot wheel looks like. Nothing. So, but anyway.
Kid, what do you make of that data?
So the chariot wheels allegedly that are shown are either a type of coral reef, so it's a specific species of coral that actually forms this structure that looks kind of like a wheel popping up from the ground with an
Huh.
axle. It's not coral that grew over chariot wheels. It's found all throughout the Red Sea.
Hmm.
And then, you may have seen some pictures or video of some kind of four-spoke looking gold wheel, right?
Yeah.
That's not an ancient Egyptian chariot wheel either. And it wouldn't be on the surface of the sand like it was displayed. So there's no chariot wheels or chariots that were found in the Red Sea there. But if people did enough digging in these possible crossing sites, maybe they would find
Hmm.
some remnant of
Hmm.
an Egyptian army. I don't know.
Hmm.
It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, but it's possible.
Well, you just burst the bubble of the evidence that I was given as a kid, not by my dad and family. Heard it at some camp somewhere in.
All right, so they just closed the video out here for the next 2 minutes, but so that's the interview between doctors McDowell and Kennedy on the early day of the Exodus. Overall, it was a really good interview. I obviously disagree with Dr. Kennedy here on his defense of an early date Exodus, and I think there's just simply more evidence for a late Exodus. account than an early date. There's a lot more evidence um, that I could go into right now, but for time's sake, since we're coming up on the hour mark, I think I'm going to conclude that here. If you made it to the end, congratulations. If you like this content, please click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And I will see you guys in the next video. So take care.